The telegram had promised a better life. But as Corinne Whitfield stepped off the train into Bentonville, Arkansas, on that scorching afternoon in July of 1883, all she could taste was dust and the bitter end of every hope she had carried west. 5 days she had traveled. 5 days of changing trains 3 times, of sleeping upright in hard wooden seats, of eating stale bread wrapped in newspaper, and sipping warm water from a leather canteen she had borrowed from a woman in St. Louis who took pity on her. 5 days of imagining this moment differently. In her mind, Everett Harding would have been waiting on the platform, nervous perhaps, holding wildflowers picked from the roadside because his letters had mentioned he was not a man of grand gestures, but a man of honest ones. They would have stood face to face, 2 strangers who had agreed to build a life together, and in the awkwardness of that first meeting, something real would have begun. Instead, Corinne stood alone on a wooden platform baking under an unforgiving sun, clutching a letter that had arrived too late, and watched families reunite around her while the heat pressed against her chest like a hand trying to push her back onto the train. At the telegraph office, a clerk with ink-stained fingers had delivered the news with the practiced detachment of a man who had said difficult things before. Everett Harding was dead, killed in a cattle stampede 3 days prior, buried already in the town cemetery because the summer heat would not wait for sentiment. Corinne did not scream. She did not collapse. She simply stood there, and the tears came the way rain comes to a landscape that has held dry too long, sudden, and without permission. Her trunk sat somewhere in the baggage car behind her. Her mourning dress clung to her skin. She had 17 cents in her reticule, no return ticket, and not a single soul within 1,000 miles who knew her name. She was 22 years old, and she had run out of places to go. The platform emptied around her. A porter loaded the last trunk onto a cart. The station master disappeared into his office. The train exhaled a long breath of steam and began to pull away, heading further west toward places she would never see. And Corinne stood there, a woman shaped like a question no one in this town had an answer to. A shadow fell across her, cutting the sun in half. Through the blur of tears, she saw a tall figure approaching, not rushing, not hesitant, moving with the steady purpose of a man who had already decided what he was going to do before he reached her. Strong fingers, rough with calluses, lifted her chin with a gentleness that did not match the hardness of the hand. A handkerchief appeared, white cotton, clean, smelling faintly of soap and open air. He pressed it to her cheek and held it there, letting the fabric absorb what words could not fix. "Welcome," the cowboy said. The cowboy. His voice was low, roughened by weather and years of speaking more to horses than to people. His eyes were green, the kind of green that made her think of deep water, and they held an understanding so complete that it closed her throat. "I am Beckett Dawson. Whatever brought you here in tears, you are not alone in this town." Corinne tried to speak. A sob came out instead, ragged and graceless. The sound of a woman who had used up her composure somewhere between Philadelphia and this dusty platform at the edge of nowhere. Beckett did not flinch. He did not look away. He did not do any of the things men usually did when confronted with a woman's open grief. He simply waited, patient as the hills in the distance, holding the handkerchief against her face until she could breathe again. "I was supposed to marry Everett Harding," she finally managed, her voice splitting on his name. "But they just told me at the telegraph office. He is dead. I have nowhere to go. No money for a return ticket. I left everything behind in Philadelphia, and now there is nothing." Beckett's jaw tightened. Something passed through his green eyes, quick and hard, like a cloud crossing the sun. "Everett was a good man," he said. "His death shook this whole town." He studied her for a long moment, and Corinne could feel herself being measured, not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of someone deciding how much weight he was willing to carry. "Come with me," he said. "My ranch has a guest room. You can stay there until we figure out what comes next. No woman should be alone and frightened in a strange town." Pride rose in Corinne's chest, old and familiar. The kind of pride that had kept her standing through funerals and evictions and the slow, grinding cruelty of living where she was not wanted. But pride did not buy train tickets. Pride did not feed you when the sun went down. She looked at this stranger with his steady eyes and his clean handkerchief and made a decision that would change both their lives. She nodded. Beckett's wagon waited at the end of the main street, hitched to two sturdy horses with dark coats shining in the heat. He helped her up onto the bench seat, one hand at her elbow, the other steadying the frame, and Corinne noticed how careful he was not to hold her any longer than necessary. The courtesy was deliberate. She filed it away. The ride to his ranch took nearly an hour, winding through rolling hills covered in summer grass that had turned golden under the relentless sun. The air smelled of baked earth and something dry and green, the scent of a land that was holding its breath against the heat. Grasshoppers leapt from the tall grass as the wagon wheels cut through, and once a red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding across the road like a dark hand reaching and releasing. The landscape was enormous. After the narrow streets and crowded tenements of Philadelphia, where even the sky felt rationed between buildings, the openness was almost violent. Corinne could see to the edge of the world in every direction, and the emptiness made her feel both terrified and strangely free. The horizon did not end. It simply kept going, blue bleeding into gold, bleeding into a pale white haze, where the sky and earth could not agree on where one stopped and the other began. Beckett did not fill the silence with empty talk, and she was grateful. She had no energy left for conversation, no reserves from which to draw pleasantries. Instead, she studied him from the corner of her eye. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with sun-darkened skin and sandy brown hair that curled slightly where it met his collar. His profile was strong, his shoulders broad beneath a worn cotton shirt, and he handled the reins with the unconscious ease of a man whose body had memorized this road years ago. "How did you know Everett?" she asked finally, needing to understand this place she had fallen into. "He was my neighbor. Our ranches share a boundary line. We helped each other during branding season, watched each other's herds when one of us had to go to town." Beckett glanced at her, and for a moment the reserve in his face softened into something almost tender. "He was excited about your arrival, talked about it for weeks, showed me your photograph, said he felt like the luckiest man in Arkansas." Fresh tears threatened, but Corinne fought them back. She had cried enough on that platform. She would not cry in this man's wagon. "I never met him," she said quietly. "We only exchanged letters. But he seemed kind and honest, and I thought we could build something good together." "Why did you leave Philadelphia?" The question was gentle, offered like an open hand rather than a demand. Corinne looked down at her own hands, clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles white. "My father died 2 years ago. His heart gave out one night in his sleep, My mother followed 6 months later. Pneumonia, the doctor said, but I think she simply stopped wanting to be here without him. She drew a breath. I was 20 years old and suddenly alone. My aunt took me in, but she had 5 children and a husband who drank his wages. I was a mouth she could not afford, and a reminder of a sister she resented. I worked at a dress shop, but the wages barely covered my board. When I saw the advertisement for mail-order brides, it seemed like the only door still open. She lifted her eyes to the horizon, where the hills rolled endlessly into blue distance. Now I have nothing again. You have a place to stay for as long as you need it, Beckett said, and there was a firmness in his voice that did not invite argument. And in the morning, we will figure out what comes next. But tonight, you will have a safe bed and a warm meal. That is something. Corinne looked at him, this stranger who spoke with such quiet certainty, and felt a small, fragile thing stir beneath her ribs. She did not yet know its name. She would not know it for weeks, but it was there, lodged like a seed in dry ground, waiting. The ranch appeared as they crested a hill, and despite everything, Corinne felt her breath catch. The house was well built, a 2-story structure with a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides, its wood weathered to a soft silver gray. Outbuildings dotted the property, a large barn, several corrals, a smaller structure behind the barn that she would later learn was the bunkhouse. Cattle grazed in the far distance, and from somewhere below the hill came the rushing sound of water moving over stone. "Is it just you here?" she asked as he helped her down from the wagon. "I have 2 ranch hands. Gideon Falk has been with me 7 years. Nolan Briggs, 5. They bunk behind the barn. And I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Party, who comes from town 3 days a week. She was here today, so the house is clean and there is food prepared." He carried her carpet bag toward the house, and Corinne followed, her legs unsteady after the long ride. The interior was surprisingly neat for a bachelor's home. The main room held a stone fireplace, comfortable furniture worn soft by use, and shelves lined with more books than she had expected to find in a cattleman's house. A dining table occupied one corner, and doorways led to a kitchen and what she assumed were bedrooms. But it was the guest room upstairs that undid her. Simple and clean. A large bed, covered in a wedding ring quilt, its pattern faded to soft colors that spoke of years of washing and care. A dresser with a porcelain wash basin, a chip on the rim that someone had smoothed down so it would not cut. A wardrobe with a door that closed properly. A small luxury she had not known in years. A window that looked out over the front of the property, framing the porch below and the golden hills beyond. The glass so clean, it made the world outside look like a painting someone had hung there just for her. And on the small table beside the bed, a jar of wildflowers. Purple and yellow and white, their stems still damp. Placed there by someone who understood that beauty mattered even in practical spaces, especially in practical spaces. Beckett set down her bag and reached into his pocket. When he opened his hand, a small brass key lay in his palm. "This room is yours," he said. "The door locks from the inside. No one enters when you do not want them to." He placed the key in her hand, and his fingers brushed hers, brief and warm and gone. Corinne closed her fist around the metal and felt its edges press into her skin. She had not had a room of her own since before her parents died. At her aunt's house, she had slept on a pallet in the hallway, separated from the family's noise by nothing but a thin curtain, a locked door, a room that was hers. It was such a small thing. It was everything. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steady for the first time since she had stepped off the train. "You did not have to help me. Most men would have walked past." "Most men are fools," Beckett replied. Something almost warm flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Rest for a while. Supper will be ready in about 2 hours." That evening, after a quiet supper of stew and cornbread with Gideon and Nolan, two weathered men in their 40s who treated Corinne with a careful respect that suggested Beckett had spoken to them before she came downstairs, Corinne insisted on washing the dishes. Beckett dried them beside her, and they worked side by side in the fading light streaming through the kitchen window, not speaking. Their hands sometimes reaching for the same plate at the same time and pulling back. It was a small, domestic rhythm, the kind of thing that could mean nothing or could mean the beginning of everything, depending on what came after. Afterward, they sat on the front porch and watched the sky turn from gold to deep violet. The heat of the day was fading. A breeze carried the scent of dry grass and something faintly sweet, like wildflowers warming in the last of the sun. Crickets had begun their evening chorus, and in the distance, a cow called to its calf, the sound low and mournful and ancient. The porch boards creaked softly under Beckett's chair as he shifted his weight, and the sound was oddly comforting, the sound of a house that had been lived in long enough to have a voice of its own. Corinne held a cup of coffee between her palms, though it was too hot for coffee. She needed something to do with her hands. "Why did you help me?" The question came out before she could stop it. "You do not know me. I could be anyone." Beckett was quiet for a long time. The kind of long that told her he was not searching for words, but deciding how many of them to release. "3 years ago," he said finally, "my younger sister traveled to Colorado to marry a man she had met only through letters." His voice had changed. The roughness was still there, but beneath it was something raw, like a wound that had scarred over but never stopped aching. When she arrived, she found that he had lied about everything: his property, his character, his intentions. She was stranded in a town where no one would help her, married to a man who... He stopped. His jaw clenched so hard that Corinne could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. His hands, resting on his knees, had gone rigid. "Her name is Lenore," he continued, and the way he said the name made it sound like both a prayer and an accusation. "By the time I got the telegram and traveled to Colorado to bring her home, she had endured things no woman should ever have to face." Silence settled between them, heavy as the coming night. Corinne did not press. She understood, in the way that women understand, what lived in the spaces between his words. "Where is she now?" Corinne asked softly. "Married to a good man in Kansas City. 2 children. She seems happy." He paused, and in the pause lived everything he could not say. But it took her a long time to feel safe again. There are still nights, I am told, when she wakes and cannot remember where she is. He turned to look at Corinne directly, and in the fading light his green eyes held something fierce and unfinished. "When I saw you crying on that platform, I thought of Lenore. I thought about how desperately she needed someone to help her and how few people bothered." His voice dropped. "So I am helping you because someone should have helped her sooner." The words landed in Corinne's chest and stayed there, warm and aching. She understood now. His kindness was not casual. It was built on guilt and grief, and a promise he had made to himself in a town in Colorado where he had arrived too late. She did not yet know the full weight of that story, the details he had held back, the way his voice had cracked on his sister's name, but she knew enough to recognize a man carrying something heavier than he let anyone see. "I am sorry she went through that," Corinne said, "and I am grateful you are not like the man who hurt her." "That is a low bar to clear," Beckett said, but there was warmth in it, a faint thaw at the edges of a man who kept himself frozen most of the time. They sat in silence after that, watching the stars appear one by one in the enormous Arkansas sky. Corinne still held the handkerchief he had given her at the station. She had tucked it into the pocket of her dress without thinking, and now she pressed her fingers against it, feeling the soft cotton through the fabric. She would keep it. She did not yet know why, only that letting go of it felt like letting go of the first kindness she had received in longer than she could remember. Morning arrived with birdsong and golden light streaming through her window. Corinne dressed and descended the stairs to find Beckett already gone, but a pot of coffee sat warm on the stove and a note rested on the kitchen table in firm, clear handwriting. "Help yourself to anything in the kitchen. Mrs. Party will arrive around 9. I will be back for lunch." She poured coffee and scrambled eggs, ate alone at the large table, washed her dishes, and was standing in the kitchen wondering what shape this strange new life would take when the front door opened and a small, quick-moving woman bustled in, carrying a basket of vegetables. "You must be the young lady Beckett told me about," the woman said. Her face was lined and sunburned, her gray hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, and her eyes were the sharp blue of someone who had spent 60 years paying attention to everything. "I am Mrs. Pardee. You can call me that, or you can call me Dorothea. But most people use Mrs. Pardee, and I have stopped correcting them." "Corinne Whitfield," Corinne said, "I am very grateful for the hospitality." Mrs. Pardee waved a hand as though hospitality were a fly to be shooed away. "Beckett has more space than he knows what to do with. It is good to have another woman in this house. Now, can you cook, clean, sew?" "Yes to all of those." "Good. Then you will help me today. I have much to do and your hands look capable." They worked together through the morning, cleaning bedrooms, washing linens, hanging them in the bright sun to dry, weeding the kitchen garden behind the house, picking beans and tomatoes and herbs for supper. Mrs. Pardee talked while she worked, her voice steady as a metronome, sharing the small histories of the town and its people with the practiced ease of a woman who knew everyone's business and had opinions about all of it. "Beckett is a good man," she said as they knelt side by side pulling weeds. "Came to Arkansas 8 years ago with nothing but determination and enough money for a down payment on this land. Built this ranch from almost nothing. Worked himself half to death those first years. Now he has one of the best herds in the county." "Why did he come to Arkansas?" Corinne asked, snapping beans with the efficiency her mother had taught her. "Running from something, same as most people who come west." Mrs. Pardee gave her a sideways look. "He does not talk about it, but I think there was something in Boston that broke him. He threw himself into this land and never looked back." She paused, her hands going still in the dirt. "He has never brought a woman to this house before. You are the first." "I am just a guest," Corinne said quickly. "A temporary charity case." "Maybe," Mrs. Pardee said, and something knowing moved across her weathered face. "Or maybe not. Do not look so startled. I am just an old woman who sees what she sees." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the sun climbing higher, the garden yielding its small green treasures. Then Mrs. Pardee spoke again, and this time her voice carried a different weight. "There is something you should know, Corinne. This town has a woman named Mrs. Eckhart. She owns the largest house on the hill past the church, and she has appointed herself the moral guardian of Bentonville. Her husband was a judge before he died, and she has never let anyone forget it." Mrs. Pardee pulled a stubborn root from the earth with more force than necessary. "She has already heard that you are staying here. A young woman, alone, in an unmarried man's house. By tomorrow, she will have told half the county that your reputation is beyond saving." Corinne's hands went still. "I did not think about that." "Of course you did not. You were thinking about survival, which is what sensible people think about. But Mrs. Eckhart has never had to survive anything except boredom, and that has made her dangerous in the particular way that comfortable people become dangerous when they have nothing to do but judge others." Mrs. Pardee reached over and patted Corinne's hand, leaving a smudge of garden dirt on her wrist. "I am telling you so you are not blindsided. Not so you are afraid. There is a difference." Corinne sat back on her heels and looked out past the garden, past the clothesline where sheets billowed white against the blue sky, past the corrals where horses moved in lazy circles, to the hills that rolled away toward a town she had not yet learned to navigate. Somewhere out there, a woman she had never met was already sharpening her tongue. Somewhere out there, a dead man's brother was on a train heading toward the inheritance he believed was his. And somewhere, in a cemetery she had not yet visited, lay the man who had written her letters full of quiet hope, who had changed his life to make room for her, who had died before she could thank him for believing she was worth sending for. She thought of her mother, who had taught her to snap beans exactly this way, thumb against the seam, a clean break. She thought of her father, who would have liked this land, this sky, this impossible openness that made you feel like the world was still being invented. She thought of the handkerchief in her dress pocket, white cotton that smelled of soap and open air, and of the man who had offered it without being asked. And here, in this garden, with dirt under her fingernails and the smell of tomato vines on her hands, Corinne Whitfield felt something she had not felt in 2 years. Not hope, not yet. Something quieter than hope, and more stubborn. The feeling a seed must have when it sits in dry ground and senses, somewhere far below, the faintest trace of water. She picked up another bean and snapped it clean. Outside, beyond the garden fence, the Arkansas hills shimmered in the afternoon heat, vast and indifferent and full of whatever came next. She was not going anywhere. Beckett took Corinne into Bentonville on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after she had arrived at the ranch. She wore her best day dress, a modest blue cotton that her mother had sewn the year before she died, and she had pinned her dark hair carefully and pressed her lips together until they held steady. She looked, she hoped, like a woman who belonged somewhere, even if she did not yet know where. The town was larger than she had expected from the wagon road. A main street stretched for several blocks, lined with wooden buildings in various states of ambition. A general store with a wide porch and barrels of goods stacked outside. A blacksmith whose hammer rang steady as a church bell across the morning air. 2 saloons, one respectable and one less so, separated by a barber shop that served as neutral ground between them. A white clapboard church with a steeple that caught the sun. And near the far end of the street, a schoolhouse, small and square and painted the color of butter, with a bell tower that leaned slightly to the left as though it had been listening to the wind for too long. Beckett helped her down from the wagon in front of the general store, and Corinne felt the weight of eyes before she saw the faces behind them. Women paused on the sidewalk. A man loading feed onto a cart looked up and did not look away. Curtains moved in second-story windows. Bentonville was a town of 300 people, and a stranger arriving in tears to a dead man's promise was the kind of story that traveled faster than the telegraph. "Miss Whitfield," Beckett said, and the formality of his voice told her he was performing for the audience they both knew was watching. "Let me introduce you to some of our neighbors." The women approached with curiosity wrapped in politeness. There was Mrs. Calloway, the sheriff's wife, a solid woman with kind eyes and gray streaking through auburn hair, who took Corinne's hand and held it rather than merely shaking it. There was Dr. Wallace, who carried his medical bag even on his day off, as though illness might ambush him outside the feed store. There was Henry the blacksmith, a giant of a man who spoke with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone whose arms were thicker than Corinne's waist. And there was Josephine Merritt. She was perhaps 24, with freckles scattered across her nose, and the kind of restless intelligence that showed in the way her eyes moved, always cataloging, always curious. She taught every grade in the Bentonville schoolhouse by herself, and the weariness of that was written in the faint shadows beneath her eyes. But so was the love of it in the way her face changed when she spoke about her students. "If you are looking for work," Josephine said after introductions had been made and Corinne's situation explained with the careful brevity that Beckett had clearly rehearsed, "the school could use help. I teach all the grades alone, and with harvest ending, attendance will increase. I need an assistant, especially with the younger children. The pay is $30 a month. It is not generous, but it is honest." Something opened in Corinne's chest. A door she had not known was there. "I would be very interested," she said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I have a solid education. My father was particular about that, and I am good with children." "Come by the schoolhouse tomorrow morning," Josephine said. "We will discuss details. And call me Josephine. I think we are close enough in age to skip the formalities when the children are not listening." Not everyone was welcoming. Some people stared with the open suspicion of those who had already made up their minds. An elderly woman near the church entrance made a disapproving sound as they passed, a sharp exhalation through the nose that communicated more than a sermon could. And standing on the porch of the largest house at the top of the hill, visible from nearly everywhere on the main street, a woman in black watched Corinne with the stillness of a hawk, deciding whether something below was worth the dive. Corinne did not need Mrs. Pardee to tell her who it was. She knew the shape of judgment. She had lived inside it for 2 years at her aunt's house. Mrs. Eckhart did not approach. She did not speak. She simply watched, and then she turned and went inside, and the door closed behind her with a sound that carried all the way down the hill. The sheriff's office sat between the barber shop and the land registry, a narrow building with a single cell visible through the back window and a desk covered in paperwork that suggested crime in Bentonville was mostly administrative. Sheriff Calloway was a lean man with graying hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing, the kind of lawman who kept peace not through force, but through the simple fact that everyone in town believed he saw everything they did. He stood when they entered and gestured to chairs. "Miss Whitfield, I am sorry we are meeting under these circumstances. Everett spoke of you often in the weeks before his death. He was looking forward to your arrival." Sheriff Calloway retrieved a folder from his desk, opened it, and smoothed the papers inside with a care that told Corinne whatever was written there mattered. Everett changed his will 2 months ago, shortly after you agreed to come to Arkansas. He left specific instructions that I need to share with you. Corinne's hands tightened in her lap. What kind of instructions? He left you a sum of $500. The number hung in the air between them like something physical, something with weight and shape. $500. Corinne had never held more than $12 at one time in her life. $500 was a year's wages at the dress shop. It was a train ticket to anywhere. It was a rented room and food and time. The one thing she had never been able to afford. Time to think. Time to choose. Time to breathe without the panic of wondering what came next. The sheriff consulted the document. His exact words were, "She is coming all this way in good faith. She deserves the means to choose her own path, whether I am there to walk it with her or not." Tears came again, and Corinne did not fight them. A man she had never met, a man who had known her only through letters written by lamplight across 1,000 miles of distance, had looked at the future and seen the possibility that he might not be in it, and had made sure she would be taken care of anyway. The generosity of that, the quiet decency of it, was almost more than she could hold. "He did that for me," she whispered, "but he never even met me." "Everett was an honorable man," Sheriff Calloway said gently. "The money is secured in the bank. You can access it whenever you are ready." Beckett had been sitting quietly beside her, but Corinne felt his presence the way you feel warmth from a fire in a cold room, without looking, without reaching, just knowing it was there. "However," the sheriff continued, and the word landed like a stone dropped into still water, "I should tell you that Everett's brother, Silas Harding, will be arriving next week to settle the estate. He is a lawyer from Missouri. He has the legal right to review the will and raise questions if he chooses to." Something in the sheriff's voice, a careful flattening, told Corinne that he was saying less than he knew. Outside the sheriff's office, Corinne had to sit on the bench in front of the building, her legs suddenly unreliable. Beckett sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his arm near hers but not touching. He gave her time. He was, she was learning, a man who understood the value of silence. $500, she said finally. "I thought I was destitute, and now I have $500. "What will you do?" Beckett asked. Corinne looked around at the dusty street, the wooden buildings standing in the August sun like stubborn teeth in an old jaw, the people going about the business of living in a place that was still deciding what kind of place it wanted to be. She thought about Philadelphia, where the rooms were smaller and the walls were closer and nobody waited for you at train stations with clean handkerchiefs. She thought about the schoolhouse and Josephine's offer and $30 a month that would make her beholden to no one. "I think I will stay," she said slowly, tasting the words as they came. "At least for a while. If Josephine offers me the teaching position, I could be independent. I could see if there is a life for me here." Something moved across Beckett's face, too quick to name. Relief, perhaps, or recognition. The look of a man who had made the same choice 8 years ago, standing on different ground, staring at a different horizon, deciding to stay. "That seems wise," he said. Take time to know the place before committing either way. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them, and rhythm, Corinne was learning, was the scaffolding on which a new life could be built. Mornings she rose before the sun had fully cleared the hills, dressed in simple cotton, and went downstairs to find Beckett already gone, but the coffee pot warm on the stove, and sometimes, though he never admitted to it, a plate covered with a cloth napkin holding biscuits he had made in the dark. She would eat alone, wash her dishes, and then walk or ride with Gideon into town for the school day. Josephine had offered her the position the very next morning, and Corinne had accepted with a gratitude she tried not to let show too much, because she was learning that in this place, people respected capability more than thankfulness. She taught reading and arithmetic to the younger children, ages 5 through 9, while Josephine managed the older students in the same room, separated by nothing but a center aisle and the understanding that education in a frontier town was a collaborative act of faith. The children were wild and sweet and full of dirt and questions, and Corinne discovered that she loved them fiercely. These small, serious faces bent over slates, sounding out words as though the letters themselves were a kind of magic that could unlock the world. Afternoons, she returned to the ranch and worked with Mrs. Pardee when the older woman was there, or alone when she was not. She weeded the kitchen garden. She mended shirts that Beckett and Gideon and Nolan left in a basket by the stairs with the wordless expectation of men who had never had to ask before. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the sounds that meant normal and the sounds that meant trouble, the difference between a cow calling for its calf and a cow calling because something was wrong. And in the evenings, she and Beckett sat on the porch. It became their place, that porch. The boards worn smooth by boots, the railing where coffee cups left rings that no one wiped away, the two chairs angled toward each other at a distance that said companionship without saying anything more. They talked about the ranch, about the town, about the weather, which in Arkansas was a subject large enough to fill entire evenings because it was never the same 2 days running, and it affected everything from cattle health to road conditions to whether the creek behind the property would hold through September. They talked about smaller things too. Beckett told her about his horses, each one by name and temperament, and Corinne heard in his voice the tenderness that he did not show to people but could not hide when speaking of animals. She told him about Philadelphia, about the sound of rain on cobblestones, and the smell of the bakery on Chestnut Street, and the way her father would read the newspaper aloud at supper, turning the events of the world into bedtime stories for a girl who believed that knowing things was a form of armor. One evening, Beckett came in from the range and paused at the kitchen door, his hand on the frame, his body still carrying the dust and weariness of 12 hours in the saddle. He stood there for a long time, and Corinne did not know he was there because she was singing. An old hymn her mother had loved, something about rivers and rest and being carried to a place where the weary are finally allowed to lay their burdens down. Her voice was not trained, but it was true, clear and steady, and full of something that formal instruction could not teach. Beckett listened until the song ended. Then he stepped back from the doorway, walked around to the front of the house, and came in through the main entrance as though he had just arrived. He never mentioned the singing, but Corinne noticed that after that evening, he always came home through the front door, and he always paused on the porch before entering, as though giving the kitchen its privacy, as though protecting something fragile and good that he was not ready to name. She discovered his secret in return. Each morning before dawn, while the house was still dark, Beckett went to the barn to tend a horse that should have been sold months ago. The animal had been injured in a fall. its left front leg damaged in a way that made it useless for ranch work. Every rancher Beckett knew had told him to sell it or put it down. Instead, he rose every morning in the dark and wrapped the leg and fed the horse by hand and spoke to it in a voice Corinne could hear through her open window but could not make out the words of. She did not tell him she knew. She understood, in the way that grief teaches you to understand, that some tenderness is only possible when you believe no one is watching. They laughed together for the first time on a Thursday evening in late August. Corinne could not later remember what started it, something about Gideon's attempt to cook when Mrs. Pardee was ill and the resulting cornbread that could have been used to shoe horses. But she remembered the sound of Beckett's laugh, low and startled, as though it had been stored somewhere deep and had burst free against his will. And she remembered the way they both went quiet afterward, looking at each other across the porch in the fading light, recognizing that something had shifted between them, some wall had developed a crack, and neither of them knew whether to seal it or let the light through. It was the numbers that found the trouble. Beckett had mentioned, almost in passing, that the ranch finances had been tight for the past 2 years. Not dangerously so, but enough that he had deferred repairs on the barn and held off buying the new breeding stock he needed. He assumed it was the market. Cattle prices had fluctuated, and a dry spring had reduced the grazing quality. When Corinne offered to look at his ledgers, he accepted with the relieved gratitude of a man who hated bookkeeping the way some men hate dentists. She spread the ledgers across the dining table on a Saturday afternoon, while Beckett and his men were out checking the northern fence line. The numbers told a story, as numbers always do, but the story they told did not match the one Beckett believed. The cattle counts were wrong. Not dramatically, not in the way that screams theft, but in the quiet way that whispers it. Over the past 2 years, the records showed sales that did not correspond to the herd counts. 30 head here, 12 there. Small enough numbers that a man who was working 16-hour days and trusting his hands to manage the details would not notice. But Corinne noticed. Her father had taught her to read ledgers the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, with attention and suspicion and the understanding that every number was either telling the truth or hiding it. Someone had been selling Beckett's cattle and keeping the money. Corinne sat back in her chair and stared at the columns of figures, her mind working. Gideon Falk, 7 years of loyal service. Nolan Briggs, 5 years, quieter, less forthcoming. She did not know enough yet to accuse anyone. She needed more information, more time to cross-reference the numbers, to identify patterns that would point to one man or the other. And she could not afford to be wrong. An accusation without proof would damage trust. And trust, she was learning, was the currency that kept a ranch running. She closed the ledger and placed it back on Beckett's desk, exactly where she had found it. She would keep looking. She would be sure before she spoke. The blow came on a Wednesday, delivered not with fists, but with the particular cruelty of a woman who had weaponized respectability. Mrs. Eckhart arrived at the schoolhouse at 2:30, just as the younger children were practicing their letters on slates. She did not knock. She simply opened this door and stood in the frame. A tall woman in mourning black, despite the fact that her husband had been dead for 6 years. Her silver hair pulled tight beneath a hat that looked like it had been designed to intimidate. "Miss Merritt," she said, addressing Josephine as though Corinne were not in the room, "I have come on behalf of several concerned families. There are parents in this community who do not feel comfortable entrusting their children to a woman of questionable character." The room went silent. 23 children looked up from their slates with the wide eyes of small animals sensing a predator. Josephine stood slowly from her desk. her face calm, but her eyes holding a heat that Corinne was grateful not to be on the receiving end of. To which woman of questionable character are you referring, Mrs. Eckhart? You know perfectly well. A young woman living under the roof of an unmarried man with no family connections, no verifiable history, no chaperone. The arrangement is improper, and the presence of such a woman in our schoolhouse sends a message to our children about what this community finds acceptable. Mrs. Eckhart's voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never questioned her own rightness, and it filled the small schoolhouse like cold water filling a room. Corinne stood. She did not plan to. Her body simply rose, the way a body rises, when it has been pushed past the point where sitting is possible. Mrs. Eckhart, she said, and her voice was steady. Though beneath the surface her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. I arrived in this town with nothing. I had no money, no family, and no options. Mr. Dawson offered me shelter when no one else did. Mrs. Pardee is at the ranch 3 days a week, and my door has a lock. I have done nothing improper, and I will not stand here and be spoken about as though I am not in the room. Mrs. Eckhart looked at Corinne for the first time, truly looked, and what passed between them was the ancient recognition of two women who understood exactly what the other was capable of. 3 families have withdrawn their children from your classes, Mrs. Eckhart said, turning back to Josephine. I expect more will follow. Then she left, the door closing behind her with a precision that was worse than a slam. Josephine exhaled. The children stared. Corinne sat back down, her hands shaking beneath the desk where no one could see them. I will not dismiss you, Josephine said quietly, after sending the children outside for early recess. But you should know she will not stop. She never does. That evening, Corinne told Beckett what had happened. She kept her voice even and her account factual because she had learned that emotion, when it was too visible, gave other people power over you. Beckett listened without interrupting. When she finished, his jaw was tight and his green eyes held a darkness she had not seen before. 3 families pulled their children, he repeated. Yes. Because of where you live. Because of what it looks like. He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkening hills. When he spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. You have done nothing wrong, Corinne. Not one thing. And I will not let this town punish you for my decision to help you. It was the first time he had used her first name in front of the night sky, and it changed something in the air between them, some boundary quietly erased. Silas Harding arrived in Bentonville on the morning train the following Monday, and Corinne knew he was trouble before he opened his mouth. It was not his appearance, though that told its own story. He was a thin man in an expensive suit, the kind of suit that cost more than a ranch hand earned in 6 months, with polished shoes that had never touched dirt and a watch chain that caught the light like a small, bright warning. His face was narrow and careful, handsome in the way that a well-made knife is handsome, all precision and no warmth. He looked like his brother only in the shape of his jaw and the color of his eyes, and even those similarities felt like something borrowed rather than shared. It was his stillness that alarmed her. He stood on the platform and looked at Bentonville the way a man looks at something he intends to own. At the sheriff's office, Silas sat across the desk from Corinne and Beckett with the relaxed posture of a man accustomed to rooms where important things were decided. Sheriff Calloway laid out the will, the bank documents, the correspondence between Corinne and Everett. Silas examined each item with the thoroughness of a lawyer and the detachment of a man for whom paper mattered more than people. $500, he said, setting down the will, left to a woman my brother never met. You must understand, Sheriff, how this appears. It appears as the will of a man who valued good faith, Calloway replied, or it appears as the result of manipulation by a stranger who exchanged letters with a lonely man and arrived conveniently after his death to collect a payout. Silas looked at Corinne. His eyes were gray, not green like his brother's, and they held the particular coldness of someone who had learned to see other people as problems to be solved. No offense intended, Miss Whitfield. I am merely asking the questions any reasonable person would ask. Corinne felt heat rise in her face, but she held her voice level. I did not know Everett was dead until I arrived. I had no knowledge of the will, and I came here to marry your brother, not to collect money from his estate. So you say. Silas smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Nonetheless, I am requesting that the $500 be held by the bank until the correspondence can be independently verified. I have that right as the surviving next of kin. Sheriff Calloway looked at Corinne with something that might have been an apology. The law does allow it, Miss Whitfield. Until the review is complete, the funds will remain frozen. $500, freedom and choice and possibility, sealed behind a bank door by a man who wore expensive shoes and smiled without meaning it. Corinne felt the ground shift beneath her again, the way it had shifted on the train platform. The sickening sensation of having something taken just when you thought you had hold of it. Beckett had not spoken during the exchange, but his silence was not passive. It was the silence of a man holding something back with considerable effort. Outside the office, he walked beside Corinne toward the wagon, and his stride was longer than usual, his shoulders rigid. He does not believe you are a fraud, Beckett said, his voice hard and quiet. He does not care whether you are or not. He wants the money, and he wants time to figure out how to get the rest. Corinne looked at him. The rest? Everett's ranch, the land, everything his brother built. Beckett's jaw worked. Silas came by my place this afternoon, looked around like he was appraising livestock, asked if I had ever thought about selling. A cold thread wound through Corinne's stomach. Silas Harding did not leave Bentonville. He took a room at the hotel and made himself a presence, appearing at the general store, at the restaurant, at the church on Sunday wearing that same careful smile, and speaking to everyone with the smooth courtesy of a man who wanted something from all of them but would not say what until he was ready. He visited Beckett's ranch twice in the following week. The first time, he rode out alone, uninvited, and stood by the corral watching the cattle with an expression Corinne could see from the kitchen window. Calculating, measuring, pricing. The second time, he brought papers. Corinne did not hear the conversation between him and Beckett, but she heard Beckett's voice through the closed study door, low and final. The answer is no, Harding. Today and every day. Silas left smiling. That was the part that frightened her. A man who smiled after being refused was a man who had expected the refusal and planned for it. The journal arrived as part of the estate review. Sheriff Calloway required Silas to share Everett's personal effects with Corinne, as she was named in the will, and Silas complied with the exaggerated courtesy of a man following rules he intended to bend later. Among the items was a small leather-bound book, its cover worn soft by handling, its pages filled with a handwriting that Corinne was learning to recognize as Everett's. She read it that evening by lamplight, sitting in the chair by her bedroom window while the ranch settled into its nighttime sounds. The entries were sparse and practical, the journal of a working man who used words carefully, but between the lines about weather and cattle and fence repairs, something tender and alive emerged. She found the entry dated 2 months before his death. Received a letter from Miss Whitfield today. She sounds intelligent and practical. I think we will suit each other well. I have not looked forward to something in a long time. And later, closer to the end, I find myself counting the days until she arrives. Is this what anticipation feels like? I had forgotten. Corinne pressed the journal against her chest and closed her eyes. She wept for this man, this stranger who had made room for her in his life before he ever saw her face, who had counted days he did not know he was running out of. She wept for the marriage they would never have, the quiet partnership of two practical people who might have learned to love each other over washboards and supper tables and long winter evenings. But it was the final entry that stopped her breath. The handwriting was different here, smaller, pressed harder into the page as though the pen were being used to hold something down. Silas came today, asked about buying the ranch again. I refused. He was angry, though he hid it behind that lawyer smile of his. My brother is not the boy I grew up with. Something changed in him, and I do not trust what he has become. Corinne read the words twice, then a third time. Then she closed the journal and sat in the dark, listening to the night sounds of Arkansas, the crickets and the wind and the distant low of cattle, and felt the shape of something she could not yet see, a pattern forming in the shadows, connecting Silas's questions and Silas's smiles, and Silas's expensive shoes to something larger and more dangerous than a disputed inheritance. Everett had not trusted his brother. Everett had written it down in ink in his own hand in a book he kept beside his bed. And now Silas was here, smiling at everyone, asking about land prices, freezing money that belonged to a dead man's promise, and looking at Beckett's ranch with the eyes of a man who was not finished taking. Corinne placed the journal in the drawer of her bedside table beside the brass key and the white handkerchief. 3 objects, 3 anchors in a life that was still finding its shape. The key that meant safety, the handkerchief that meant kindness. And now the journal, which meant that a good man had seen the danger and tried to leave a warning. She would not ignore it. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Beckett had gone to bed an hour ago, and the only sound was the ticking of the clock in the main room and the wind moving through the grass outside. Corinne lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and let the pieces arrange themselves in her mind. The frozen money, the ranch visits, the ledger with its missing cattle. Silas Harding's smile. She did not yet know how they connected, but she knew they did. And she knew with the certainty of a woman who had survived enough to recognize when survival was being required of her again, that the testing was not over. It was only beginning. She told him on a Saturday evening, after Mrs. Pardee had gone home and Gideon and Nolan had retired to the bunkhouse. Corinne spread the ledgers across the dining table the way a surgeon lays out instruments, each book open to the pages she had marked with thin strips of torn paper. She had spent 2 weeks verifying the numbers, cross-referencing cattle counts with sale receipts, matching dates to market trips, tracing the slow hemorrhage of livestock from Beckett's herd. She was certain now. She had been certain for 3 days, but she had waited because certainty without preparation was just panic wearing a better dress. Beckett stood across the table from her, his hands flat on the wood, his green eyes moving across the columns of figures as she explained. He did not interrupt. He did not ask her to slow down. He listened the way he did everything, completely, as though the world had narrowed to the space between her voice and his understanding. 30 to 40, head over 2 years, Corinne said. Sold in small batches, never more than a dozen at a time. The sales were timed to coincide with your trips to town or your visits to the northern range, when one of the hands would have been alone with access to the herd and the records. Beckett's face did not change. That was what frightened her. When a man who feels deeply shows nothing, it means the feeling has gone past the point where the face can hold it. Who? He said. I cannot prove which one. Not yet. The records were altered carefully by someone who understood the system well enough to hide the discrepancies in the margins. But I have narrowed the pattern. She paused. Nolan has been making trips into town on evenings when he has no stated reason to go. Gideon has not. Nolan bought a new saddle last month. A hand saddle. Good quality. The kind that costs more than a month's wages. Beckett closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted behind the green. Something old and tired that she recognized as the particular weariness of a man discovering that trust has been misplaced. 7 years, he said, and she knew he was talking about Gideon. 5 years. Nolan. The arithmetic of loyalty, suddenly unreliable. Do not confront them yet, Corinne said. If we move too quickly, whoever it is will destroy evidence. Or run. And we still do not know whether this connects to Silas. Beckett looked at her across the table, covered in his own betrayed numbers, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with ledgers. It was the recognition that they were no longer host and guest. They were partners facing the same problem from the same side. The distance that propriety and circumstance had maintained between them collapsed in that moment, quietly, like a fence post rotting through and falling without sound. You found this, he said. You saw what I could not see in my own books. Numbers are easier to read than people, Corinne replied. They do not know how to lie well. The faintest ghost of a smile crossed his mouth. Neither do you. The conversation that changed everything happened 3 nights later, not because either of them planned it, but because some things, held inside long enough, simply refused to stay. It had been a hard day. The drought was tightening its grip on the county, turning the creek to a trickle and the grass to straw. Beckett and Gideon had spent 12 hours moving cattle to the southern pasture where the water still held, and Beckett had come home with dust in the lines of his face and a silence heavier than usual. Corinne had cooked supper, and he had eaten without tasting it, and afterward they had settled into their chairs by the fireplace because the evenings were growing cool now that September had arrived, and the fire was needed not just for warmth, but for the way it filled a room with sound when people could not. The logs shifted and sent a spray of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, and Beckett began to speak. Not because Corinne asked. She had learned by now that asking him direct questions about the past was like pulling on a door that opened outward. You had to step back and give it room. So she simply sat there, her hands still in her lap, the firelight making shadows on the walls, and she waited. When I got to Colorado, Beckett said, his voice low, aimed at the fire rather than at her. Lenore did not cry when she saw me. She did not speak. She was sitting in a chair by a window in a boarding house where the sheriff had placed her after arresting her husband, and she was looking at nothing. Her eyes were open, but she was not behind them. He paused. The fire cracked. The clock ticked. The man she married had lied about everything. There was no ranch, no property, just a shack outside of town, and debts, and a temper that came out when he drank, which was every night. She tried to leave twice. The first time he found her on the road and dragged her back. The second time, he locked her in the root cellar for 4 days. Corinne's breath stopped. She held herself very still, understanding that any movement, any sound from her might seal the door he had opened. She sent me a letter, Beckett continued, and now his voice had changed, stripped down to something raw and exposed, like wood with the paint burned off. Smuggled it out through a neighbor woman who took pity on her. I received it on a Tuesday. I remember because I was in the middle of branding, and I told myself I would go to her when the week was finished. Then the week finished, and there was a fence down on the north boundary, and I told myself I would go when that was repaired. Then the fence was repaired and the market trip was coming, and I told myself she was probably exaggerating, that it could not be as bad as the letter made it sound. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, had gone white at the knuckles. 6 weeks, Corinne. I left my sister in that place for 6 weeks because I was busy, because I was tired, because it was easier to believe the lie that she was fine than to face the truth that she was not. His shoulders began to shake. Not dramatically, not the way grief looks in stories. Just a tremor, deep and involuntary. The kind of shaking that happens when something held rigid for too long finally gives way. His head dropped forward, his face hidden, his hands gripping the chair arms as though they were the only things keeping him upright. "She will never be the same," he said, and his voice cracked on the word same, split clean down the middle. "And that is on me. That is mine to carry." Corinne did not say it was not his fault. She did not offer comfort made of words that would bounce off the surface of what he was feeling without ever reaching it. She rose from her chair and crossed the space between them and sat on the floor beside his chair and placed her hand on his arm. She could feel the tremor moving through him, the shaking of a man who had held himself together for 3 years and was, in this fire-lit room, allowing himself to fall apart in front of the only person he trusted enough to see it. She stayed there. She did not speak. She let the fire and the wind and the ticking clock fill the silence around them, and she held on. When the shaking stopped, when his breathing had steadied and his hands had loosened their grip, Beckett raised his head and looked at her. His eyes were wet and red and entirely unguarded, and she understood that what she was seeing was a gift. A man like Beckett did not weep in front of people. He wept alone, or he did not weep at all. What he had given her was not weakness. It was the most complete form of trust she had ever received. "Thank you," he whispered, "for staying." Corinne nodded. Then, because he had given her the truth, she gave him hers. She told him about her aunt. Not the version she had shared before, the abbreviated account of unwelcome and hardship. The real version. The one she had never spoken aloud. "My aunt did not simply resent me," she said, looking at the fire because it was easier than looking at him. "She punished me for existing. When visitors came to the house, she would lock me in the storage closet off the kitchen, a space no bigger than a coffin, dark, with the smell of onions and old potatoes. She told me to be silent, and I was, because I had learned that silence was the price of a roof over my head." Her voice was steady. That was the thing about old pain. It did not make you cry anymore. It made you still. She told the neighbors, I was the illegitimate daughter of her dead sister, a charity case, a burden she bore out of Christian duty. When the money I earned at the dress shop was not enough to satisfy her, she would lock me out of the house at night, and I would sleep in the alley behind the bakery on Chestnut Street, where the ovens kept the brick wall warm enough that I would not freeze. She heard Beckett's intake of breath, sharp and short, the sound of a man absorbing a blow. I did not beg, Corinne said. Not once. I did everything she asked. I cooked her meals. I scrubbed her floors. I mended her children's clothes. And I saved every penny I could hide from her until I had enough to answer Everett's advertisement. I left Philadelphia at 4 a.m. while she slept, and I did not leave a note because she did not deserve one. Silence. The fire had burned low, its light reduced to a warm glow that softened the edges of the room and the faces in it. You did not beg, Beckett repeated, and the way he said it was not a question. It was recognition. He was seeing her, all of her, the parts that were steel and the parts that were scar, and he was not looking away. Would it have helped? Corinne asked. No, Beckett said quietly. That is why you are here. Something moved in the space between them, invisible and enormous. Not romance, not yet, though it would become that. Something more foundational. The understanding that they had each been broken in different ways and had each survived by means that the other recognized and respected. They were, in that moment, no longer strangers finding their way around each other's edges. They were two people who had shown each other the worst of what they carried and found that the other could hold it without flinching. Corinne, Beckett said. Her first name, spoken into the firelight like something he had been holding in his mouth for days. Beckett, she replied. His name, offered back with the same quiet weight. They did not need to say anything else. The names were enough. The wall was down. The drought worsened in the second week of September. The creek behind the ranch, which Beckett said had never run dry in the 8 years he had owned the property, thinned to a thread of muddy water barely wide enough to reflect the sky. Cattle gathered at its banks and lowed with the low, desperate sound of animals who knew something was wrong but could not name it. Gideon and Nolan hauled water from the deeper well near the barn, but even that was dropping, and the tension on the ranch took on the quality of a rope being wound tighter each day. The horse fell ill on a Thursday. Not just any horse, Beckett's horse. The injured one he had nursed for months, the one he fed by hand in the dark before dawn, the one Corinne heard him talking to through her open window. It stopped eating. Its eyes went dull. It stood with its head low and its breathing shallow, and Beckett knelt beside it in the stall with his hand on its neck and a look on his face that Corinne recognized because she had worn it herself. The look of someone watching something they love slip away and not knowing how to stop it. Corinne went to the kitchen garden. She had noticed things growing there that Mrs. Pardee had planted not for eating, but for remedy. Yarrow along the fence, chamomile in the corner bed, wild sage near the well. Her mother had known plants, had learned from her own mother, had kept a small journal of remedies that Corinne had memorized the way other children memorized Bible verses, because in her family, knowledge was the inheritance that could not be taken away. She gathered what she needed and boiled water and made a poultice and a tea and carried them to the barn where Beckett was still kneeling in the straw, his hand still on the horse's neck, his face the color of someone holding vigil. "Move," she said, not unkindly, but with the authority of a woman who knew what she was doing and did not have time to be polite about it. Beckett moved. He watched as she applied the poultice to the horse's leg and coaxed the animal to drink the tea from a bucket, stroking its muzzle and speaking to it in a low voice that Beckett had never heard her use before, soft and rhythmic, almost like singing. The horse drank. Its ears, which had been flat, lifted slightly. It was not a cure, but it was a beginning. She came back every 4 hours through the night, checking the poultice, offering more tea, sitting with the animal in the straw while the barn creaked around her and the stars moved slowly past the open door. Beckett found her there at 3 a.m, asleep against the stall wall, the horse's head resting near her knee, both of them breathing in the slow rhythm of exhausted creatures who had found something to lean against. He covered her with a blanket and sat down across the stall and stayed until dawn. By morning, the horse was eating again. By the end of the week, it was standing straighter. Gideon, who had watched the whole thing from a respectful distance, summed it up over supper. "Is there anything you cannot do, Miss Whitfield?" Corinne looked at Beckett. "I cannot ride a horse properly. Not yet." Beckett's mouth curved. A real smile, slow and warm, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. "That," he said, "I can teach you." He taught her the following Sunday afternoon in the corral behind the barn, with Gideon watching from the fence rail and offering commentary that was not helpful and not meant to be. Beckett saddled the gentlest horse on the ranch, a bay mare named Copper, who had the patience of a woman who had raised too many children, and he showed Corinne how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to move with the animal rather than against it. His hands were on her waist as she climbed into the saddle, steadying her, and the warmth of his grip through the cotton of her dress was like a sentence spoken in a language she was only beginning to learn. He held on a moment longer than necessary. Then his hands dropped and he stepped back, and neither of them mentioned it, and both of them remembered it. Mrs. Eckhart called the town meeting on the last Tuesday of September, and this time she came prepared. The meeting was held in the town hall, a building that served as courthouse, dance hall, and community gathering place depending on the season. Benches had been arranged in rows, and when Corinne arrived with Beckett, half the town was already seated. She saw Josephine near the front, her face tight. She saw Mrs. Pardee in the third row, arms folded, jaw set. She saw Silas Harding standing along the side wall, arms crossed, watching with the detached interest of a man at a horse auction. Mrs. Eckhart stood at the front of the room and spoke for 10 minutes about community standards, about the moral obligation of a town to protect its children from improper influences, about the sacred duty of upholding decency. She did not name Corinne directly. She did not need to. Everyone in the room knew who she was talking about, and the indirectness of the attack made it worse, because it allowed each person to fill in the blanks with whatever suspicion they carried. Then Silas stepped forward, and the room shifted. "I would simply like to add," he said, his lawyer's voice smooth and measured, filling the room the way oil fills water, coating everything it touches, "that this young woman arrived in our town under circumstances that remain unverified. She claims to have been Everett's intended bride. She claims the letters between them were genuine, but my brother is not here to confirm or deny, and the $500 in his will represents a significant sum to leave to a stranger." He paused. "I cast no aspersions. I merely ask that the community consider whether complete trust is warranted." Complete trust. The words hung in the air like smoke. designed to make everyone in the room question what they had seen with their own eyes and felt with their own instincts. Corinne sat very still. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her spine straight, her face showing nothing, because she had learned long ago that the people who want to see you crumble are the ones you must never crumble in front of. Beckett stood. He did not rise quickly. He rose the way a tree rises from the ground, slow and steady, and rooted in something deep. He turned to face the room, not Mrs. Eckhart, not Silas, but the people of Bentonville, the neighbors and shopkeepers and families who had watched Corinne teach their children and buy supplies at their stores and walk their streets with her head up and her back straight for 2 months. "Corinne Whitfield," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of the room, "came to this town with nothing, no money, no family, no one waiting for her. The man she was supposed to marry was in the ground before she arrived, and she had every reason to get back on that train and disappear. She did not." He looked at Mrs. Eckhart. She stayed. She took a teaching position and showed up every morning, including the mornings after some of you pulled your children from her classroom. She has worked at my ranch without pay, keeping house and managing accounts, and she has done it with a dignity that some of the people in this room could learn from. He looked at Silas. "She never asked for the money your brother left her. She did not know about it until the sheriff told her. And she has not spent a single cent of it, not that she could, since you froze it." He turned back to the room. "If anyone here has a problem with Corinne Whitfield living at my ranch, say it to me, not behind her back, not through committees and meetings and speeches about decency, to my face. But do not stand in this room and question the character of a woman who has given this community more than she has received from it. That I will not allow." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Josephine stood, then Dr. Wallace, then Mrs. Calloway, then Henry the blacksmith, who simply said, "The man is right," and sat back down, and somehow that settled it. The vote went against Mrs. Eckhart. Corinne would keep her position. But as the crowd dispersed, Corinne saw the look that passed between Mrs. Eckhart and Silas, brief and sharp. The look of two people who had expected this outcome and had already planned for what came next. The proof came together the way Corinne had known it would, not in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of small certainties. Nolan Briggs had been making trips to a cattle buyer in the next county, a man named Fenton who, when Corinne asked Josephine about him, turned out to have business connections in Missouri, in Silas Harding's county. The new saddle, the evening absences. The way Nolan's eyes shifted when Corinne sat at the dining table with the ledgers open, as though he could feel the numbers tightening around him like a rope. Beckett confronted Nolan on a Thursday evening in the barn with Gideon standing behind him as witness. Corinne listened from the kitchen, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that this was a conversation between men who had worked together, and her presence would change its shape in ways that were not useful. Nolan denied it. Then Beckett showed him the ledger pages Corinne had marked. Nolan went quiet. Then he went pale. Then he said 3 words that confirmed everything. He paid well. Beckett told him to be gone by morning. Nolan packed his things and rode out before the sun set, his silhouette shrinking against the western sky until it was swallowed by the hills. The fire started 4 hours later. Corinne smelled it before she saw it. Smoke, not the comfortable smoke of a fireplace, but the sharp chemical smell of something that should not be burning. She ran to the window and saw the glow, orange and terrible, rising from behind the barn. The horse barn was ablaze. She flew down the stairs and out the back door. Beckett and Gideon were already there, hauling water, pulling open stall doors, dragging terrified animals into the night. The heat was enormous, a wall of it, pushing back against anyone who tried to get close. Sparks rose into the black sky like inverted stars, and the sound of the fire was the worst part. Not a roar, but a breathing, as though something alive and hungry were consuming the barn from the inside. They saved most of the horses, but not all. When it was over, when the fire had been beaten down to smoldering wreckage and the surviving horses were corralled and trembling in the far paddock, Corinne stood in the yard and stared at what remained. 3 horses dead, the barn destroyed. And among the dead, lying still in the scorched straw, was the horse she had nursed back to health. The horse Beckett had cared for every morning in the dark. Corinne walked to the animal and knelt beside it. She placed her hand on its still neck where the skin was warm but not from life, and she felt everything she had held together for months come apart at once. Not just the horse, everything. Her parents, the train platform, the letter that came too late, the aunt who locked her in closets, the woman on the hill who called her improper, the man in the expensive shoes who called her a fraud, and now this creature she had poured her knowledge and her care into, dead because someone had set a fire to cover the trail of stolen cattle. She wept. Not the controlled tears of the train platform, not the quiet tears of reading Everett's journal. These were the tears of a woman who had reached the bottom of her reserves, raw and ugly and unstoppable, the sound of someone breaking open. Beckett knelt beside her. His clothes were blackened with soot. His hands were burned in places. He said nothing. He simply knelt there, on the ground beside the dead horse and the weeping woman, and stayed. The way she had stayed beside his chair when he broke down by the fire. The way she had stayed in the barn all night when the horse was sick. They were learning each other's language of grief, and the grammar was simple. You showed up. You did not leave. When her tears slowed, Beckett reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough and warm and singed at the edges, and her fingers closed around it with a strength that surprised them both. Above them, the smoke drifted east, and the stars, indifferent and eternal, continued their slow rotation across the Arkansas sky. Somewhere out on the dark road, Nolan Briggs was riding toward whatever waited for him, and on the porch of the ruined ranch, where the smell of burning wood would linger for weeks, Beckett Dawson held the hand of Corinne Whitfield and did not let go. The barn smoldered for 2 days. Long after the flames had died, the timbers continued to give off heat and a thin gray smoke that clung to the property like a ghost that refused to leave. The smell was everywhere. In the house, in the linens, in the water drawn from the well. It settled into Corinne's hair and the creases of her clothing, and no amount of washing could remove it entirely. She would smell it for weeks afterward, catching it at unexpected moments, a phantom reminder of the night everything changed. Beckett worked without stopping. He and Gideon cleared the wreckage, sorted what could be salvaged from what could not, constructed temporary shelters for the surviving horses from lumber that had been meant for fence repairs. He moved with the grim efficiency of a man who understood that grief was a luxury he could not yet afford, that the ranch demanded his hands before it would allow him his heart. Corinne watched him from the kitchen window, his shirt dark with sweat, his movements mechanical, and she recognized the look on his face because she had worn it herself. The blank expression of a person holding everything in because letting anything out would mean letting all of it out, and there was no time for all of it. She cooked for him. She made sure coffee was hot when he came in. She mended the work gloves he had torn pulling nails from burning wood. She did not try to make him talk about it because she understood, in the way that only someone who has lost things understands, that some damage has to be walked through silently before it can be spoken about. Mrs. Party came every day that week, not just her usual 3. She brought food from town, supplies from the general store, and the quiet company of a woman who had survived her own losses and knew that presence was worth more than words. She also brought news. Nolan was seen in Crawford County 2 days ago, Mrs. Party said, setting a basket of bread on the kitchen table. Sheriff Calloway has sent word, and there is talk in town that Silas Harding has been visiting the bank every day since the fire. Corinne felt the cold thread in her stomach tighten. The blow fell on a Wednesday, delivered in an envelope carried by a bank clerk who rode out to the ranch on a borrowed horse and handed it to Beckett with the apologetic expression of a man who knew he was carrying bad news, but whose job required him to carry it anyway. Beckett read the letter standing in the yard, the sun behind him, his shadow stretching long across the ground. Corinne stood on the porch and watched his face change. Not dramatically. Beckett was not a man whose face moved in dramatic ways, but something behind his eyes went out, like a lamp being turned down, and when he looked up at her, she knew. "Silas bought my banknote," he said. His voice was flat, scrubbed of everything. "The mortgage on the ranch. He purchased it from the bank this morning. I have 30 days to pay the full balance, or he takes the property." The words hung between them in the warm October air, simple and devastating, the way the most destructive things often are. Corinne came down the porch steps. "How much?" "More than I have. More than I can raise in 30 days, even if I sold every head of cattle at market price, which I cannot do because the drought has depressed prices and because Nolan already stole 1/3 of my herd." He folded the letter carefully, precisely, the way a man folds something when his hands need a task to keep them from shaking. "He planned this," Corinne said. It was not a question. "From the beginning. The cattle theft, the fire, the debt. He has been taking this ranch apart piece by piece, and I was too busy working it to see. I was the one who found the ledger discrepancies," Corinne said. "If I had found them sooner." "You found them at all. No one else would have." Beckett looked at her, and beneath the flatness in his voice, she heard something raw. "This is not your fault, Corinne. None of it." That evening, Silas Harding rode out to the ranch. He came alone, on a fine roan horse that had been rented from the livery, wearing his expensive suit, as though he were attending a business meeting, which, Corinne supposed, he was. He sat on his horse in the yard and did not dismount, and Beckett stood on the porch and did not invite him to. "I am prepared to offer a fair price for the property," Silas said, his voice carrying the practiced pleasantness of a man who had won and wanted the losing to be civilized. "Well below market value, of course, given the condition of the ranch after the unfortunate fire, but enough for you to start fresh somewhere else." Beckett said nothing. "Or," Silas continued, adjusting his gloves with the casual precision of a man who enjoyed his own performance, "you can try to raise the balance in 30 days, fail, and lose everything. The choice is yours, Mr. Dawson. I am merely offering a less painful way to arrive at the same destination." Corinne stepped out onto the porch beside Beckett. She had not planned to, but she found that she could not stand inside the house and listen to this man dismantle Beckett's life through the kitchen window. She stood beside him, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and she looked at Silas Harding with the level gaze of a woman who had been locked in closets and told she was worthless and had survived both. Silas glanced at her. A flicker of something crossed his face. Irritation, perhaps. Or the recognition that the equation he had calculated did not include this variable. 30 days, Beckett said. His voice was quiet and immovable. Get off my land. Silas smiled, tipped his hat, and rode away. The dust from his horse hung in the air long after he disappeared over the hill. That night, Corinne could not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the creaking wood, the wind at the windows, the distant restless sounds of cattle in the temporary corrals. She thought about Everett Harding, the man she had never met, the man who had counted the days until her arrival and had not lived to see her step off the train. She thought about his journal, the sparse practical entries, the brief flashes of hope, the warning about Silas at the end. She rose and lit the lamp and took the journal from her bedside drawer. She had read it twice already, but something nagged at her, a feeling that she had skimmed past something important, that the pages held more than she had extracted. She read slowly this time, not for the emotions in the words, but for the information beneath them. Everett had been a careful man, a man who recorded expenses and weather and cattle counts with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. She paid attention to the details now. She found it on the second to last page, written in smaller script than the rest, pressed into the bottom margin as though it had been added in haste or in secret. The ink was slightly different, darker, applied with a heavier hand. Important papers in the tin box under the floorboards of the horse barn. If something happens to me, they must be found. Corinne read it 3 times. Her pulse quickened. Everett's horse barn, not Beckett's. Everett's ranch, which had been sold to a family from Texas after his death. The barn where he kept his own horses, where he worked every day, where he would have had privacy and access. He had hidden something. Something he wanted found if he was no longer alive to reveal it himself. She went downstairs. Beckett was not in bed. He was sitting in the main room in the dark, a bottle of whiskey on the table beside him, a glass in his hand that he had not yet raised to his lips. He was staring at nothing, and in the faint moonlight coming through the window, he looked like a man sitting inside the ruins of his own life, surveying the damage and finding it comprehensive. Beckett. He looked up. The bottle was nearly full. The glass was still clean. He had poured it, but he had not drunk it, and Corinne understood that even the gesture of reaching for the whiskey had been a kind of test he had given himself, a measurement of how close to the edge he had come. She sat down across from him and placed the journal open on the table between them, angled so he could read the words at the bottom of the page. Beckett leaned forward. He read it. He read it again. When he looked up, the lamp in his eyes had been turned back on, low but burning. Everett's barn, he said. The ranch belongs to the Pickering family now. They bought it from Silas after the estate sale. But if Everett hid something under the floorboards, it may still be there. If Silas knew about it, he would have found it already. Silas did not read the journal carefully. He handed it over because the sheriff required it. He thought it was a dead man's diary, not a map. Beckett was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed the whiskey bottle to the far side of the table with his fingertips. A small, deliberate gesture, like a man closing a door he had been standing in front of. "We go tomorrow," he said. The Pickering family was a young couple from East Texas with 3 children and the bewildered optimism of people who had bought a ranch without fully understanding what that meant. The wife, Martha, recognized Beckett and welcomed them, and when he explained that Everett had left personal items hidden in the barn, she led them there herself, curious but not suspicious. Everett's barn was smaller than Beckett's had been, a single-story structure with stalls for 4 horses and a tack room at the back. The floorboards were rough-hewn pine, fitted tightly, and Corinne knelt and began testing them one by one, pressing, lifting, searching for the board that moved differently from the others. She found it in the 3rd stall, a board that shifted slightly under pressure, its nails not fully seated. Beckett worked it free with a pry bar, and beneath it, nestled in a shallow cavity dug into the packed earth, sat a tin box, square about the size of a bread loaf, its lid sealed with wax. Corinne lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected. She brushed the dirt from its surface and looked at Beckett, and in his eyes she saw something she had not seen since the fire. Hope, fragile and cautious, but present. They opened it in the wagon, away from the Pickering family's curious eyes. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, were 3 items. The first was a letter from a lawyer in St. Louis addressed to Everett, confirming that the documents enclosed constituted sufficient evidence to pursue legal action against Silas Harding for fraud. The letter was dated 4 months before Everett's death. The second was a set of financial records, written in a hand that was not Everett's. They showed that Silas had forged their father's signature on inheritance documents years earlier, diverting the majority of the family estate to himself. The money Silas had used for law school, for his house in Missouri, for his polished shoes and expensive suits, all of it had been stolen from the inheritance that should have been split equally between the brothers. The third was a handwritten note from Everett. The ink was steady, the words careful, the tone of a man who was preparing for the possibility that he might not be there to speak for himself. If you are reading this, I was not able to bring these papers to the lawyer myself. Silas has been asking to buy my ranch. I believe he knows I have found proof of what he did to our father's estate. I do not want to believe my brother would harm me, but I no longer know what he is capable of. These papers are the truth. Please see that they reach the proper authorities. Corinne held the note in her hands and felt the weight of it. Not the weight of the paper, but the weight of a dead man's foresight, his quiet courage, his determination to leave the truth where someone could find it, even if he could not deliver it himself. Everett Harding had known. He had known his brother was dangerous, had known the inheritance was stolen, had known that his refusal to sell the ranch made him an obstacle that Silas might decide to remove. And he had prepared for it, not with violence or confrontation, but with paper and ink and a tin box under the floor, the weapons of a good man who believed that the truth, properly documented, would eventually win. "He saved us," Corinne whispered. "From the grave, he saved us." Beckett's hand found hers on the seat of the wagon. He held it the way he had held it the night of the fire, tightly, as though she were the one fixed point in a world that had been spinning. "No," he said quietly. "You saved us. You read the journal. You found the words. Everett left the map, but you are the one who followed it." But the crisis was not finished with them yet. That evening, back at the ranch, the relief of the discovery collided with the accumulated weight of everything that had come before, and the collision happened in the kitchen, in the yellow light of the oil lamp over 2 cups of coffee that neither of them drank. Beckett sat at the table with the tin box in front of him and the fire's aftermath still written on his hands, burns healing into pink scars across his knuckles and palms. He had been silent since they returned, the kind of silence that was not peaceful but pressurized, the quiet of a man who was trying to hold too many things at once and feeling them slip. "You should leave, Corinne." The words came out flat, rehearsed. She understood that he had been building toward them all day, constructing the sentence the way he built fences, post by post, with the grim determination of a man doing something he believed was necessary. "Philadelphia is not ideal, but you have $500 now, or you will once the sheriff releases it. You could go anywhere. Start fresh in a city where no one knows your name, where you do not have to fight for every inch of ground." Corinne set down her coffee cup. The porcelain clicked against the wooden table, a small, precise sound in the quiet kitchen. "Is that what you want?" she asked. Her voice was level, but her chest was tight because she could hear what lived beneath his words. Not rejection, protection. The same instinct that had made him ride to Colorado for Lenore. The same guilt that told him that the people he cared about ended up damaged, and therefore the kindest thing he could do was send them away before the damage reached them. "What I want does not matter," Beckett said. "The ranch is failing. Silas may still find a way even with the evidence, and you have already been dragged through enough because of me. The gossip, the town meeting, the fire. You came here to start a new life, not to be caught in the wreckage of mine." "Beckett, I cannot offer you anything, Corinne. I may not even have this house in 30 days. I cannot ask you to stay when staying means standing on a floor that might be pulled out from under both of us." "Beckett," he stopped. Corinne looked at him across the table, this man who had wiped her tears with a clean handkerchief on a dusty platform, who had given her a room with a key that locked from the inside, who had stood up in a town hall and told an entire community that she mattered. This man who believed, in the deepest and most damaged part of himself, that caring for people was something he did badly, that his love was a thing that arrived too late, that everyone he reached for was better off beyond his reach. "I did not come here for a house," she said. "I did not come here for $500. I did not even come here for Everett, though I would have honored that marriage with everything I had. I came here because I had nowhere left to go, and I stayed because for the first time in my life, someone made me feel like I was not a burden." Her voice cracked. She let it. She was done being composed. "You gave me a key, Beckett, a key to a room with a door that locked. Do you have any idea what that meant to a woman who had been locked in closets? You gave me a place at your table and work for my hands and evenings on your porch where I could sit and breathe and not be afraid. You did not ask me to earn it. You did not keep score. You simply gave it, and then you were surprised when I did not want to leave." She reached across the table and took his scarred hands in hers. "If you lose this ranch, I will still be here. If you lose everything you built, I will still be here. I am not staying for the roof or the land or the cattle. I am staying for you. And you do not get to decide for me that I would be better off somewhere else. Because I have spent my entire life being told where I belong by people who did not love me. You are the first person who ever let me choose. So let me choose now." Beckett's hands trembled in hers. His jaw worked. His eyes, green and bright and wet, held hers with an intensity that was almost unbearable. "I am afraid," he said, and the admission cost him something visible, a stripping away of armor that left him exposed in the lamplight. "I am afraid of failing you the way I failed Lenore. You did not fail her. You went to her. You brought her home. You carried that guilt because you love her, and that is not failure, Beckett. That is love paying a price it should not have to pay." She lifted his hand to her face and pressed his palm against her cheek, the way he had pressed his handkerchief against her tears on the day they met. The calluses were rough. The burns were tender. She held his hand there and closed her eyes. "You do not need to protect me," she whispered. "You need to let me fight beside you." Beckett exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, the sound of something vast and heavy being set down. He turned his hand against her cheek so that his fingers curled into her hair, gentle, trembling, reverent. "Stay," he said. One word, everything. "I am not going anywhere," Corinne replied. "I told you that the first week. I meant it then. I mean it now." Sheriff Calloway took the tin box and its contents on a Friday morning. Corinne delivered it herself, walking into the sheriff's office with Beckett beside her and Gideon behind them as witness. She laid the items on the desk one by one. The lawyer's letter, the financial records, Everett's note. She added her own evidence, the ledger pages documenting the stolen cattle, and the pattern that connected the sales to Silas through Nolan and the buyer in the next county. She placed them in order, clearly labeled, the way her father had taught her to present numbers, so that the truth was visible even to someone who did not want to see it. Sheriff Calloway read everything. He read it twice. Then he looked up at Corinne with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. The look of a man who had suspected something was wrong and was simultaneously relieved and grieved to be proven right. "This is sufficient," he said. "For the fraud charges, certainly. The connection to the cattle theft, very likely. And the note from Everett regarding his concerns about his own safety opens questions that will need to be investigated by authorities beyond my jurisdiction." He placed the documents in his safe and locked it. "The $500 will be released to you immediately, Miss Whitfield, and the banknote that Mr. Harding purchased will be reviewed for legal validity, given that the funds used to acquire it may be traceable to fraudulent proceeds." Corinne nodded. She did not trust her voice. They arrested Silas Harding at the Bentonville Bank on a Tuesday afternoon. He was standing at the teller's window, conducting the preliminary paperwork for the seizure of Beckett's ranch, when Sheriff Calloway walked through the front door. There was no drama, no shouting, no struggle, no desperate attempt to flee. Sheriff Calloway crossed the polished floor with the unhurried stride of a man who had been doing this work for 20 years, placed his hand on Silas Harding's shoulder, and said in a voice that was neither loud nor soft, but simply final, "Mr. Harding, you are under arrest." Silas went still. The banker behind the window went still. The two customers waiting in line went still. The clock on the wall ticked into the silence with the indifference of an object that measures time without caring what happens inside it. Then Silas turned, slowly, and looked through the bank's front window. Corinne was standing on the sidewalk outside, her back straight, the white handkerchief visible in the pocket of her dress, her face showing neither triumph nor hatred, just steadiness. The steadiness of a woman who had been underestimated by every person who had ever looked at her and had survived them all. Silas stared at her for a long moment. She saw the calculation leave his eyes, replaced by the flat recognition of a man who finally understood that he had lost, and that the instrument of his defeat was not the sheriff or the law or the evidence in the tin box, but the woman he had called a fraud, the stranger his brother had believed in, the girl with nothing who had turned out to have everything that mattered. He looked away. The sheriff led him out through the back door. Beckett appeared beside Corinne on the sidewalk. He did not speak. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, rough against smooth, warm against warm. They stood there in the October sunlight while the town moved around them, while people passed and nodded and whispered, while the dust settled on another chapter of a story that was not yet finished. The ranch was safe. The money was released. The man who had tried to destroy them was in a cell awaiting transfer to Missouri. And on the sidewalk in front of the Bentonville Bank, Beckett Dawson held the hand of Corinne Whitfield and did not let go, and this time neither of them pretended it was only about comfort or solidarity or the relief of a crisis resolved. It was about something older and simpler and more terrifying than any of those things. It was about love, unspoken still, but no longer hidden, visible now to anyone who cared to look, including the two people standing in the middle of it, holding on to each other in the warm light of an Arkansas afternoon, finally, on the other side of the dark. October softened into November, and the land exhaled. Rain came at last. 2 days of steady, soaking rain that filled the creek and turned the dust to mud and made the cattle lift their heads and stand in it with the dumb gratitude of creatures who had forgotten what water felt like. The grass would not recover until spring, but the wells rose and the air lost its parched edge, and the ranch, wounded as it was, began to breathe again. Beckett rebuilt. Not the barn, not yet. That would take winter's planning and spring's labor and lumber that had to be ordered from Little Rock. But he mended what could be mended. Fences, corrals. The temporary shelters became less temporary. Gideon worked beside him with the wordless loyalty of a man who had been proven trustworthy by the simple fact of still being there, and 2 younger hands were hired from a neighboring county to replace what Nolan's betrayal had taken. Silas was transferred to Missouri to stand trial. The charges were extensive: fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit theft. The connection to the fire was being investigated, and Sheriff Calloway told Corinne privately that Nolan Briggs had been apprehended near the border and was talking freely in exchange for leniency. The web Silas had woven was unraveling thread by thread, and at the center of each thread was a lie he had told so many times he had perhaps begun to believe it. The $500 was released to Corinne on a cold Wednesday morning. She walked to the bank, signed the papers, and held the sum in her hands for exactly long enough to feel the weight of what it represented. Then she walked to the schoolhouse and spoke with Josephine. "I want to use part of this to build a reading room for the school," Corinne said. "A proper one, with shelves and books, and a place where children can sit and discover that the world is larger than what they can see from this town. I want to name it after Everett Harding." Josephine looked at her for a long moment, then embraced her, and neither of them spoke, because some things are too full for words. The Everett Harding Reading Room was built that winter, attached to the east wall of the schoolhouse, funded by Corinne's $200 and supplemented by donations from families across the county who had heard the story and wanted to be part of it. The first book placed on the shelf was a volume of poetry that Josephine donated from her own collection. The second was a primer on arithmetic that Corinne ordered from Philadelphia. The third was Everett's journal, placed in a glass case near the door, open to the page where he had written, "I find myself counting the days until she arrives. Is this what anticipation feels like?" I had forgotten. Mrs. Eckhart did not contribute to the reading room, but she did not oppose it either. And one afternoon in late November, Corinne passed her on the street in front of the church, and Mrs. Eckhart paused, looked at her with an expression that was not warm but was no longer hostile, and nodded. A single dip of the chin, brief as a blink, acknowledging something she would never say aloud. Corinne nodded back. It was not forgiveness, and it was not friendship. It was something more practical than either. It was two women recognizing that they had measured each other and arrived at a reluctant equilibrium. Beckett told her he loved her on an afternoon in late September, though she had known it long before he found the words. They had ridden out together to check the fence along the far boundary, the same fence that had needed mending since before Corinne arrived. The same hills she had watched from the kitchen window all those months, gold turning to amber, turning to the pale brown of late autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek had begun to shed their leaves, and they fell around the horses like small golden coins tossed into the air by an invisible and generous hand. "I love this time of year," Corinne said, breathing in the clean air that smelled of damp earth and turning leaves and the faint sweetness of decay that is not sad but necessary. The smell of the world making room for what comes next. Everything feels possible in autumn. "Why is that?" Beckett asked, riding beside her on a gray gelding that had survived the fire and seemed, like its owner, steadier for having come through it. "Maybe because it is a time of harvest, of reaping what was planted, or maybe because the heat breaks, and you can finally think clearly." She looked at him, at the way the feeding sunlight caught the lines beside his eyes, lines that had been carved by weather and worry, and that she had come to love because they were part of him. "When I stepped off that train in July, I thought my life was over, but it was actually just beginning." Beckett reined in his horse. Corinne stopped beside him. They were alone in the meadow, surrounded by nothing but grass and sky and the sound of the creek running full again after the rains. Corinne. The way he said her name. She would remember it for the rest of her life. Not loud, not urgent, quiet. The way you say something you have been holding in your chest for so long that releasing it feels like both a relief and a risk. "That night before the fire, I was going to tell you something. I have been trying to find a way back to that sentence ever since." "I know," she said. "I have been waiting. When you stepped off that train, I thought I was helping a stranger because of Lenore, because of guilt, because I needed to prove that I could be the person who showed up on time for once. But that was only the first day. After that, everything changed." He turned in his saddle to face her fully, and his green eyes held nothing back. "You became the reason I come home. You became the voice I listen for when I ride in from the range. You became the person I think about when I am mending a fence or checking the herd, wondering what you are doing, hoping your day was kind to you. You made my house a home, Corinne. Not with cooking or cleaning or keeping the books, though you do all of that, and do it better than anyone I have known. You made it a home by being in it, by being you." His voice was shaking. This man who had stared down fire and ruin and a brother's betrayal without flinching was trembling over words. And the vulnerability of that was the most beautiful thing Corinne had ever seen. I love you, he said, completely. And if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, then I would like to spend the rest of my life earning the right to say that every day. Corinne looked at him through eyes that were blurring, not with sadness, never again with sadness, but with the particular brightness that comes when something you have wanted and feared in equal measure is finally standing in front of you, open and real and waiting. I love you, she said. Not because you saved me on that platform. Not because you gave me a roof or a job or a place at your table. I love you because you let me save you back. You let me see your grief and your guilt and the parts of yourself you hide from everyone. You let me fight beside you instead of standing behind you. You never once made me feel like a burden, Beckett. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know what that means to someone who was told her whole life that she was one? He dismounted. She watched him come to her side, and when he reached up to help her down, his hands at her waist were steady now, sure, holding her as though she were something he had finally allowed himself to want. Her feet touched the ground, his hands stayed, her palms rested against his chest, and she could feel his heart beating, fast and strong, the heart of a man who had spent years building walls and was watching the last of them come down. He leaned his forehead against hers. They stood there, breathing the same air, the horses grazing beside them, the creek murmuring, the autumn light pouring gold across the meadow like a benediction. Then he kissed her, gently, the way you touch something you have waited for and do not want to rush. His mouth was warm and his hands were careful, and the world contracted to the space between them and then expanded again, larger than before, because it now contained this tenderness, this choice, this extraordinary, ordinary miracle of two people who had found each other in the wreckage and decided to build. When they drew apart, Corinne reached into the pocket of her dress and took out the handkerchief. White cotton, soft with washing, the edges fraying slightly from months of being carried and held and pressed between fingers that needed something to hold on to. She lifted it and wiped the dampness from Beckett's forehead gently, the way he had wiped her tears on the day they met. I have kept this since the first day, she said. I know, Beckett said. I have seen it in your pocket every day since July. I never asked for it back. Why not? Because you needed it more than I did. And because every time I saw it there, I knew you were still here. He proposed in December, on a cold morning when frost made the porch rails glitter like they had been dusted with ground glass. Corinne came downstairs to find him kneeling on the boards where she had first set foot 5 months before, a small velvet box in his roughened hands, his breath making clouds in the frigid air. Corinne Whitfield, he said, and his voice was rough, but his eyes were clear. You stepped off a train in tears, and I said one word to you. I would like to say more now, if you will let me. Will you build a life with me? Will you be my wife? Will you let this house be your home? Not as a guest, not as a charity, but as the woman I love and the partner I need and the best thing that has ever walked through my door. Yes, Corinne said. She did not hesitate. She did not weigh. She said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and is only now being spoken. Yes, from the day you handed me that key, Beckett. Yes, the ring was gold, simple, with a single small diamond that caught the winter light. It fit her finger, as though it had been waiting there for it. They married in the Bentonville church on the last Saturday of January 1884, 6 months after Corinne had arrived in tears on a wooden platform and found a man with a clean handkerchief and a single word of welcome. The whole town attended. Josephine stood as maid of honor, Gideon as best man. Mrs. Pardee wept from the second row with the joyful abandon of a woman who had known this was coming before either of them did. Dr. Wallace brought his wife. Henry the blacksmith wore a suit for what his friends said was the first time in living memory. Sheriff Calloway and his wife sat near the front, and the sheriff allowed himself a rare smile. And in the last row, alone, wearing black as always, Mrs. Eckhart sat with her hands folded in her lap. She did not smile. She did not cry. But she was there. She had come. And when the ceremony ended and the congregation rose to applaud, Corinne saw Mrs. Eckhart stand with them. And that was enough. Corinne wore cream-colored silk, sewn by Mrs. Pardee with lace at the collar, and cuffs that had come from a bolt of fabric Josephine had ordered from St. Louis as a secret gift. Becket wore a dark suit that made his green eyes look like deep water, and when Corinne walked down the aisle toward him, his face opened into a smile so complete and so unguarded that it made her want to run to him. Propriety and measured pace and bridal dignity all be forgotten. They spoke their vows. They exchanged rings. The Reverend pronounced them married, and Becket kissed her, and the kiss was a promise made in front of everyone they knew, a public declaration that what had started with tears and kindness had become something permanent and chosen and real. That night, in the bed that was now theirs, in the house that was now theirs, in the life that they had built from nothing but courage and stubbornness and the willingness to show each other the worst of what they carried, Corinne lay with her head on Becket's chest and listened to his heartbeat. "Are you happy?" he asked, his fingers moving through her hair. "Happier than I knew was possible," she said. "When I stepped off of that train, I thought everything was ending. I thought I had traveled 1,000 miles to arrive at nothing." "You arrived at everything," Becket said. "You just did not know it yet." Years later, when the ranch had expanded and the barn had been rebuilt, and 2 children played in the yard where ashes had once fallen like black snow, Corinne would sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sun go down over the Arkansas hills. On the kitchen table inside, a jar of wildflowers, purple and yellow and white, freshly cut, the way Mrs. Pardee had placed them in her room on the very first day. On the shelf above the fireplace, Everett's journal, its leather cover worn soft from years of handling, open sometimes to the pages she returned to when she needed to remember where all of this had started, and in the pocket of her dress, always, the handkerchief. White cotton gone soft with age, its edges frayed, carrying the faint memory of soap and open air and a stranger's hand lifting her chin on the worst day of her life. She had come west with nothing. She had found everything. "Thank you," she would whisper sometimes, in the quiet moments when the children were asleep and Becket was reading by the fire, and the night sounds of the ranch settled around her like a blanket. She said it to the memory of Everett Harding, the man who had brought her here, who had counted the days, who had left her the means to choose her own path. She said it to the journey itself, the grief and the fear and the long train ride through a country she did not know toward a future she could not see. And she said it to the man in the other room, the quiet man with green eyes and calloused hands who had found her crying on a platform and had done the simplest, most extraordinary thing one person can do for another. He had shown up. He had stayed. He had said welcome and meant it, and that had been enough to change everything.